Thank you. Welcome, everyone. We're going to talk a bit about QML architecture and design and how you should think about QML. We have a lot of ground to cover, so I'll skip this route. But first, at Viking Software, we're trying to give away a drone tomorrow. At the last talk I'm giving tomorrow, I'm giving 3 talks this year, so I've been busy writing slides. It's a C++ API drone. And it's very small, but it's a lot of fun. It's quite aggressive, and another thing, yeah. So to win this drone, you just have to promise us your firstborn, and you do that by writing your name and email and throwing it in one of these metal bins. That if I'd been a magician, I would have called them my lovely assistants, but you can't get a man into a dress these days without a SoMe lawsuit. Sorry. So put a business card in there, and if you don't have a business card, fill in a form, just your name and email, and I'll draw one tomorrow. And if you're not in the room tomorrow, we'll mail it to you. So the next thing I'll say that you need to know about me is I have pun jokes at the bottom of my slide. There is no reason for this other than that my slides are incredibly boring. So I thought I'd have a joke on each of them. I'm sure they're not funny because pun jokes aren't, or they are if you're like me. So I don't know, whatever. So me, I run Viking Software. That's my company. I have a couple of these guys in green shirts running around with the dog pan thing. We are all over Europe. We can help you with your project. If you have a company that needs some help, then call me. But enough of that. Well, yes, I know I'm in a suit, but I am actually a developer. Trust me, I didn't completely switch to the dark side yet. I have been here since March 1997. So I dare you to find 5 people here who have more experience than me at this. So I actually know what I'm doing, sort of. I hope. QML, how can you discuss design choices if you don't know what's good and bad? And for this talk, I'm going to look at what's good and bad for C++ and for QML. So let's start with the good things of this one first. I really like QML. I like the idea. It's obvious when you're an old school Qt guy like me where this came from. It came from one guy sitting, can't I just write some kind of a tool that does all the connection from signals to slots for me instead of having to write all of this boiler code and the connect in C++ and so on. And I'm completely sure this was where QML came from. It's quite easy to do these connects that we do in C++. It's less code, it's much faster. Yeah, just pass the bins around there, throw your business cards in, write stuff. I'll talk while you do it. The other good thing about QML is that the interfaces are very smooth to look at. It says here it's fast, which is a bit wrong actually, because QWidget-based user interfaces are very fast as well. But they're not smooth in the same sense. You can't do smooth animations of moving a QWidget, for example. You can do that with QML. And this is, when I look at should you use QML or QWidgets, this is one of the big ones. Are you doing animation stuff or not? Then you definitely need QML. I really like that you get inside the code, you get sort of a visual feel for how do your user interface look like, unless you're using the designer, and then you just see it, of course, but I write code most of the time. So I like that there is this connection between the code directly and what you see on the screen. So bad things. There are some things in QML that's not really there yet. I don't know. How many of you here have just recently started doing QML code? Okay, that's 38.2%. Good. So you will probably have figured out that you need to change your way of thinking. Doing QML coding is not like doing C++ coding. So that switch in your mind is something that is hard to do. You can look at QML code, you can look at the examples and say, yes, I can understand what that does. And then you look at a blank screen and say, now I need to fill that up with my own QML stuff. And there is a disconnect there. It's really, really hard to going from looking at the examples to actually writing your first application that's based on QML. And it's much harder than it is to do with widgets. Now, I hate JavaScript intensely, and who doesn't? Yes, my man. So I have been after the guy who made the decision to go with JavaScript, and for years he kept saying, yes, I would have made the same choice. But last year I got him to accept that he should probably have chosen Python instead, or something else. I hate it, but we're stuck with it. Live with it. One of the real annoying things with QML is if you have larger teams, it gets worse, because the structure of a QML application is more messy. If you're doing coding 20 years ago, you would probably say it smells. And that's because it's difficult to do right. And this, as the team grows, this becomes even more messy. And messy in software, that's not good. So this is a problem we haven't solved yet. Then there's a really bad thing. Have you tried debugging QML code? We're back to printf debugging if you're lucky. And I don't know about you, but that's not my favorite way to spend a day. Maybe if it's really dark outside and it rains, but I don't know. You can actually unit test some of this. It's not impossible, so I shouldn't write that. But it is more difficult. There isn't just a simple way to just integrate unit testing as there is with C++. And this does annoy me. Now, the third one here, that's the one that really annoys me. That when you write QML code, you have the data and the logic inside the same file as where you have the UI code. I don't know about you, but I was taught MVP pattern when I was at university, or MVC pattern, and that's a no-no. And it's very, very hard to not fall into that trap. And a lot of what I do today is tell you, do not do anything in QML other than write just only the UI layer there, and very, very little functionality. If you remember that when you go out of here, I've done a good job. That's not a lot. That's easy. So, thank you. I'm out of here. The deployment is not as bad. Just put it in an RC file if you don't have a lot of them, and then it ships with your executable. If it's not in the RC file, then it becomes a little more annoying. And it is very easy for the user to manipulate your UI by modifying the QML files after he downloaded your application. There are ways to get around that by doing hashing of the files and so on, but it is actually a bit difficult to ship a QML file and lock it down so your users cannot do anything about it. I would suggest, if you really have that problem, get the commercial version so you have the compiler. That helps a lot. So, C++ strengths. I am an old C++ guy, and I love C++. I do love QML as well, so I'm not here to tell you that QML is bad. Not at all. I'm here to tell you this you should do in QML. This you should do in C++. C++ is very good to write stuff that we know is good and can't crash, right? Yeah, sort of. But we know this stuff. Let's move on to something that's better. So the bad things. The syntax, at least if you're a new developer, is quite daunting. And there are still quite a lot of things in the C++ syntax that I don't use. And I've been doing C++ coding for 25 years or something like that. For example, I have a whole book about template metaprogramming, which I should just burn, because if any of my guys do that, I'm going to go after them. The really difficult part in some of what you do with C++ is how you do stuff that's not really compatible. For example, in the last talk, he talked about how to do a Qt Designer plugin for custom widgets. And there was a guy who asked about deployment of those. And that's a good question, because if you have actually tried to create a Qt-based plugin, you would know that they just don't show up a lot of the time, and you don't know why. And the only thing you can do about it is to single step with your debugger through the Q plugin loader code. And that's not fun. But then you'll find that it's something like, yeah, you build it with release mode and your Qt designer was running in debug mode. That doesn't work. Stuff like that is just annoying, and you hit it all the time when you work with C++, especially if you have one team doing one compiler and one team doing another compiler, and they check in something, and now it breaks in the CI system, and it's like, ah. So shouldn't they have done it in a branch before merging? Yes, they should, but that's another thing. So this is sort of the first thing that, that you need to go to when you're thinking about what should we do with this. Did I mention that I hate JavaScript? What you see there is the 11th commandment. So keep that in mind. Don't write code that's actually JavaScript based. In the early days of QML, there was an idea that we could create a Qt-based application simply with text files. You'd have the QML files for the UI and JavaScript for the coding. That was one of the original ideas, and fortunately, I don't think anyone remembers that, but now I told you, so now you do. Sorry. You should unlearn that, because that is a horrible idea. I have actually seen a company do this. I had a customer from Los Angeles, which is quite far away from Denmark, where I live, and there was no time zone overlap, so it was difficult to talk to them. And they say, we have this application, it's QML-based, can you help? And I naively just said yes, because I'm a consultant and that's what we do. So they sent me the code and they sent me the application, and I got to just do exactly what I said this is difficult to avoid. I could just modify the QML files and the JavaScript files in the executable directory and start it again, and I could see what happened. Now, you can fix this code, right? And you can add features. And then I looked at it and said, yeah. So they had implemented full table models in JavaScript. And I was looking at this code and say, okay, I know I'm not a good JavaScript guy. I don't want to be because I hate it. So, but this, it was completely ununderstandable. It was untested, it didn't work, and I at some point I did get it to work, but it took me a horrible amount of time. If they had done a proper C++ model, I could just have fixed it in no time. So don't do that. Just avoid it. There are JavaScript uses in QML, and the places where you should use that is only in the event handlers. Don't do anything else, pretty much. Sure, there are exceptions to that, but try and avoid them. Try and stay with only the event handlers to put JavaScript code in there. Then you will be happy, or happier. I can't say that you're happy. So one thing that comes from the whole testable point of view is you should try and make very modularized, that's a difficult word, modularized code. That solves some of the problems I had in one of the bad slides. You make small QML components, very small. And so the problem is that QML codes, they tend to grow these files. I've seen QML files of over 5,000 lines, and you can't navigate them. There is no structure because it's one big tree. It goes like that for you. And it's very hard to navigate through a file. It's almost impossible to follow the way that things move inside this tree. So try and rip out code from that, put it in a separate file, componenticize your code by taking small amounts of code. Ooh. And was it that bad? And put that in a separate files, because then you can test that file alone. You can look at that file and say, what can I do about this thing? Can I make sure that it actually works? And then you can also use it in other places, perhaps. Reusability is not as useful as we thought it would be, but it is possible at least. So keep that in mind. Make very small QML files. Avoid more than 1,000 lines of QML files. Just put a note to yourself in the back of your head. If you see the lines count go beyond 1,000 lines, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to split the files, because sometimes it's not easy to do that, but it would help you. Yeah, I think that's what I will say about that one. So, the other part of the application, C++, that's where all your logic should be. A lot of what we actually use QML for, especially if it's on mobile, is just manipulating lists of things. So you have, if you're on a phone, I will bet you that 90% of the apps you use is just a list of items where you choose one, manipulate it, or it will lead you into another list. Think about it later. It is true. And all of these list models needs to be in C++. So let's look at how we actually do this. When you do a singleton model, you only have one of them. It runs your entire application or whatever. This is what you do. You create a C++ class at the top, and in the main or whatever, in the initialize function, you do something beneath. You instantiate your object, and then you say QML register uncreatable type. An uncreatable type, that's a weird thing. It's a type of an object that you cannot create, but you cannot create it because you already did that in C++, because you apply it here. You just say to the QML that you can use this by name, and I'll show that on the next slide. We import what we just did, and you just say, my model is this MC object, and that's it. It's sort of magic. I don't expect you to remember this, obviously. What I need you to do is remember the pattern and the way of thinking. And you can find this one, or you can look at the documentation on what you actually do when you need to do this. I'm not trying to teach you this code. I'm telling you this is what you should do, and then look it up when you actually need it, because everything else would be really annoying. So, we have another one here. We have a class in C++ that we do want to be able to create objects from in QML. So we have the property systems in QObject, which is great. You just expose some properties and an enum, and this QInvocable means that you can just call the function from JavaScript, sorry, but that's the way it is. And then you register the type down here, and now you can create objects of type backend in your code, like this. And you can manipulate the properties, you can add another property and bind them to this one. And this is what I do all the time when I write the C++ code. These are the two things that the only two things you need to remember. Create the types of objects, like we just did here, or create the uncreatable type for singletons. And we do that all the time. It seems so simple when I say it here, but this is actually what we do when we write a C++ layer and expose it to the QML side. This is not rocket science, and I have had a project for ESA, so I know about this stuff. So that's, yeah, I have 6 minutes left. So when you do this project of QML, I couldn't do a design and architecture talk without talking a bit about how you actually structure the things. And it seems so obvious to me that I don't even know if this is actually useful, or it really is obvious to me. So if it is obvious, bear with me, sorry. It does repeat some of the things like that I already said, like don't have too large files. The last thing down here, you can read the rest. Bindings. This is the really good thing about QML, that you can use these bindings all over the place. And this makes the code simpler. So if you have a button that depends, if you press this button down, then something folds down. If you press it again, it folds up. No, yeah, so a checkbox, let's say a checkbox. Fold, fold. Checkbox checked, this folds down. Then you just bind these two directly together. This is common knowledge. This is what we do in QML. This is the whole point of QML, other than doing smooth animations. But the problem is that when you write QML over time, these connections seems to explode. And that's when you hit performance problems with QML. There are two forms of performance problems in QML code. One is loading time. You usually try and solve that with loader objects. The other one is binding explosions. And what happens is that when you change some property somewhere, it propagates into another one, that propagates into another one, and then they just spread. And one of the real problems of QML is that it is so hard to see that this actually happens. The only way you actually see this is when you start to have performance problems. And that's obviously not good, because your users usually run things on slower computers than you do, unless you're on embedded, and then you have complete control. But it's really difficult to find this, and I think that everyone who writes QML should actually, from time to time, just run your application on a slow computer to see if it's still useful in this case. Now, when you do hit these binding explosions, you're sort of screwed, because it's almost impossible to get back from. There are ways you can do it, but the biggest problem is to figure out what causes this. And I simply don't have a trick for you. I don't have any way of knowing that this happens other than looking at the code and trying to figure out what it is. There are some QML profilers that you can try and use, and I would suggest you look at that if you hit this problem. But it is very difficult to do anything about. So that's the one thing, that it's one of the places where we still have it to do in the QML community of supplying something to you that you can use. So that is, for now, it. I have 2 minutes for questions. I will be outside for more questions, or you can visit the Viking Software booth out there. If you have anything else, or if you want to participate in the drone competition. And I'm sorry I didn't have more time, because I could have spent an entire day talking about this thing, because it's such a huge topic. So I think we have time for 1 or 2 quick questions. What? Oh, I have plenty of time for questions then. You can ask me anything related to something broke. Anyone okay? Do we need an ambulance? Okay, so question.
So in the first version that you showed us with the context property of the model, you created a context property, MC, as I remember it. But then, before you registered it, yes, you said that we had to do a QML register on creatable type here. Why is that?
This is what tells the QML system what the type is. There are some extra things that this does. It reads more into the object itself than just putting it on the set context property. For example, it will tell you what enums are there. If you just do the set context property, you will have access to the properties by it's using the dynamic property system of QObject. If you don't know what that means, come see my QObject deep dive talk tomorrow. But the first line here, so you can actually just do that one. Okay. And if you don't hit problems, that's enough. But if you say, why isn't exported, try that one, and that usually works. And I'm sure there is some set of rules, what it actually does. I haven't figured it out, and I don't care. I usually always just register the uncreatable type, because if I do this without either having an uncreatable type or a creatable type, I'm sitting there looking at that one and saying, I wonder what I'm actually doing here. This is a note to self as well. that the unbreakable, no, not unbreakable, I can do that. Uncreatable type is something that you can't instantiate.
Yeah. Is there any, because you said that this will work without the registering the, does anyone have a question? Sorry. I'm asking again, but I'm going.
Shoot away.
So without doing the register uncreatable call, we can, you said, still use it, and it actually, it only tells you something if you look at the main function here, because in the QML file, you won't know it because you still use it with MC. Is there any like overhead to calling either QML register type or QML register uncreatable types, even though you don't need that introspection into the type itself, like accessing enums and such?
Is there any overheads doing this? I simply don't know, because I never do this more than in the initialization code of the C++ layer. And that happens so fast that I've never figured out if there is, I mean, if I did this 1,000 times, would that be a problem? I have no idea. I would say you should probably do something else instead of doing this 1,000 times. So my answer is that there shouldn't be an answer, because the problem shouldn't exist. Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay, good. More questions? Anyone else? Come on. I charge a lot of money for this. I'm a consultant. There is one down there. If you have a question that's not directly QML related or to this, you can ask it as well. You can ask me anything about Qt.
Okay, I tried QML and I have got a lot of problem with area overlap objects. We really don't know where we have event. Sometimes the list view is over, the thing under. It's really complicated to order things. Do you have a astuce for that?
So when it happens to me as well. And I've been writing QML code for 10 years, which is pretty much when it was possible to do it. It is impossible not to get in this situation where you don't know exactly what item you're hitting if you press on it. And the way I usually do it is to create a yellow rectangle around it. So put yellow rectangles, because there's nothing in a user interface that looks like a yellow rectangle. So you're always safe. You can always put that in there. And if you're the one guy sitting there saying, I have that, then do blue or whatever. So it's actually the only thing I can tell you. And usually your anchoring is the problem, that you need to fix the anchoring of where things sit when you size your window. One of them is going to be wrong. And the way you track that is to make these yellow rectangles and put them inside the tree, which means you start at the top and then you move it down into the tree of the code. And then you can see it visually. Where are my things? Because now they're in colored rectangles. I even go to 2 colors sometimes, if it's difficult.
Good. So
One more question?
Yeah. What is your preference for how many context properties we use? Like one for the whole application or a lot of small ones?
Oh, that's a difficult question. Well, for singletons, it's almost easy, because you can choose 2 things. If you have a singleton that pretty much just returns pointers to other objects, then you have the choice of doing that or just registering the objects. Either one's good. Do what you like. If you don't have it as clear as that, I don't think there is a simple choice, and I would have to see your code before I can make up my mind. So, sorry, not a clear answer. I am told that I am out of time, so come by the Viking booth if you want to talk to me.